Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webcast today. This is Craig Saperstein. I'm a partner in the public policy practice at the Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, Pittman law firm, and I'm based here in Washington, D.C. And Pillsbury is so honored to host this webcast with our friends at Guidehouse, as well as the Association of Cyprus Banks. Of course, the title of our webinar is Cyprus Cementing a Culture of Compliance. We are so lucky to be joined today by several leaders in the banking industry in Cyprus, both individuals who are well steeped in the business operations of banks in Cyprus, as well as the compliance functions in banks in Cyprus. And I'm really pleased that my partner in crime today with Guidehouse is Alma Angadi. As some of you may know, Alma is a partner in the financial services segment and global legislative regulatory leader at Guidehouse. She really is a true expert in compliance and investigations, focusing on AML, CFT, and economic sanctions compliance. And just quite frankly, as a lawyer in the space, when we think of who we need to partner with to help our clients with either legal or compliance issues, Alma is pretty much always our first call. So we're so pleased to partner with her in helping our clients and partner with Guidehouse on this webinar today, along with the Association of Cyprus Banks. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists today from Cyprus. First, Dr. Haris Poengari is the Deputy CEO and heads the Business Banking Division of Bank of Cyprus, which is the largest bank on the island. He has the duty of defining the strategy of all the divisions under his responsibility in order to achieve the bank's strategic objectives. And Dr. Poengari is going to give us an overview of the Cyprus economy and the banking sector and how it has evolved over the past few years. Also pleased to be joined by Mario Skandalis, who is the director of the compliance division of the Bank of Cyprus. He's the president of Cyprus Integrity and the VP and founding member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners Cyprus. And he's also a board member of the International Advisory Board of the International Compliance Association. And we're also pleased to be joined by Mateos Haralambidis from Hellenic Bank. Mateos is the Chief Compliance Officer and Anti-Money Laundering Compliance Officer for Hellenic Bank. I've had the great pleasure working with the Association of Cyprus Banks to meet with scores of both policymakers, legislative leaders, and bank executives with Marios and Mateos over the past few years, and I can assure you you'll have a very compelling presentation from them today. So just very briefly, our agenda for the day, we're going to talk a little bit about the Cyprus economy and banking sector. Then we'll provide a overview of the banking regulatory framework in Cyprus, and we'll focus a lot on some of the comprehensive reforms that Cyprus has made in the past few years and how independent organizations and other countries are recognizing both the regulatory reforms that Cyprus has undertaken, as well as the culture of compliance that's been instituted at banks in Cyprus. And then we'll talk about how Cyprus is locking in all of the progress they've made in managing a dynamic international landscape. And we'll do some comparing and contrasting of how Cyprus, how the policies and the culture of compliance in Cyprus are comparable to those in the U.S. and in other jurisdictions around the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Poengari to handle the next couple of slides describing the Cyprus economy and the banking sector writ large. Dr. Poengari, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm very happy and honored to be with you this afternoon. I will talk a little bit about the economy. First of all, how is Cyprus economy today? The real GDP of the country presented a reduction of around 5% during the COVID year of 2020. But the right next year of 2021, we have a positive increase of the GDP of about the same amount of 5%. So we actually rebounded back. We have significant unemployment reduction through the last years, and it's less than 7%, around 7% now. We improved evaluations by international organizations, institutions, and credit rating agencies. Despite COVID, we continued our efforts de-risking and improving the bank's balance sheets. We kept on and we deleveraged the banking sector. And finally, we worked on the reduction of bad loans, the NPLs, and we increased the new fresh lending and our deposit base. And let's move on and look what was the contributing factors back in 2013 crisis. At that time, the size of the banking sector relative to the Cyprus economy was too big. It was standing at around 641%. Now it's substantially lower. We had a high percentage of NPL loans at about close to 50%. We have a large portion of deposits from Russia and other CIS countries. We're amounting around 13% of the total deposit base of the banking sector. We had a weak regulatory framework. We have an increased role of professional intermediaries. There was lack of AML training across the system. A bail-in was required for the two major banks of the country. We had a weak corporate and overall governance framework, as well as high degree of unethical or unhealthy practices. Okay, and this was the main reason for the economic crisis of 2013. Let's see now where we stand today. Today, we have locked in the implementation of advanced compliance regulations and policies, including on ultimate beneficial owners registry, which will be publicly available. Massive investment in compliance and revolution in cultural and processes, significant leverage of the banking sector, and especially exposure on international business. Our deposits now of Russia and CIS countries is only around 6% of the total deposits of the system, and considering material any changes that will happen. Significantly reduced exposures with Russia, CIS, and other high-risk jurisdictions. Banks have minimized reliance on any third parties, especially professional intermediaries, and they have no role for AML screening now. And finally, effectively address the shell company activities and citizenship by investment program, which we now have a very strict level of screening. That's how we finally achieved what we think a high compliance culture for the whole banking system. Thank you. And now I pass on to Marios Skandalis, my colleague, for the next chapter.
Thank you very much, Haris. Actually, for us, compliance and governance officers, it all started back in 2013, when the banking crisis erupted in Cyprus, which had as a result the second largest bank of the island shutting down, and the largest bank of the island, as Bank of Cyprus, having its depositors receiving a haircut of nearly 50% of their deposits. it was actually not a requirement by Troika, which stepped in to bail out the Cyprus economy, but it was actually these events that triggered the remediation, that triggered the reformations that we had to undertake further to these events. So basically, Troika bailed out the economy of Cyprus back in 2013. And as compliance officers thought that, and also the management of the banks, decided that that was the end of the old practices of the past, and it was the beginning of a new chapter, which if we have not commenced this new beginning of the new chapter, that would be game over for the Cyprus economy, because you don't get such immense measures happening and taking it really lightly. And for this reason, we decided that we were going to follow a path not of conformity with the regulatory framework in place, but rather identifying and setting certain benchmarks of international excellence and adopting to those standards, because, you know, when you don't want to simply enhance your framework in place, but you want to regain the credibility of your stakeholders, then simply conforming to law is not enough. You have to demonstrate that you are one of the leaders globally in terms of conformity, in terms of compliance, in terms of governance. And for this reason, we have commenced a huge remediation program which lasted for a few years, as from year 2014. As my colleague Dr. Bangare has presented before, it was a strategy focusing primarily on two key main pillars: de-risking and deleveraging. We had the banking sector back in 2012 corresponding to 8 times the GDP of the country. And today, we are just less than three times the GDP, which is within the norm. We have de-risked from heavily exposure on non-performing loans, and we are back onto normal percentages at the moment. But most importantly, the thing that segregates Cyprus today as a high regulated and highly governed jurisdiction is its compliance program. And I'm going to give you a few examples what led exposures to CIS countries and what led flows to those countries in Russia falling less than more than 50% of what it used to be. I mean, from market shares like Dr. Bangare mentioned before in Russian deposits, let's say, from 12% dropping back to less than 5% today, or flows to these countries. And when we mention Russia and CIS countries, we also have a few other additional high-risk jurisdictions. The flows, both in US dollar transactions as well as in euro transactions, have decreased by more than 80%. This is just a small example of the outcome of the compliance program. Certain areas which we have set internationally accredited benchmarks is also sanctions. In Cyprus, none of the financial institutions is a US person, but we have consciously elected, apart from conforming to the EU and UN sanctions, to also conform to OFAC's sanctions. And it has been too many times that we have terminated relationships solely on the basis of OFAC sanctions, facing a real legal risk of having clients suing us, validly suing us, since we are not US persons and we did not have the obligation to be conforming to the OFAC sanctions, but we gladly did it. And we have faced such lawsuits, but we have considered any cost deriving from that as an investment of our credibility and of our sustainability. And coming a bit back to the statistics, that it was the outcome of these remediation measures, we would like to note that during this period of time from 2014 until year 2018, more than 85,000 of accounts were terminated solely on compliance reasons, corresponding to actually more than 13 billion of euros of annual turnover and 65 million of euros of annual net profitability. If you consider that the GDP of the country is around of 11 to 12 billion per year, you can actually determine the magnitude of the outcome of this huge remediation program we applied in Cyprus. Also, Dr. Bangare has mentioned the aspect of UBOs. We have been one of the first jurisdictions that have introduced face-to-face meetings with the ultimate beneficial owners prior to the inception of even one single transaction of the relationship. Also, the UBO registries are nearly in place, and thus from the end of next year's first quarter, these registries will be accessible on a public basis further to the announcement of the government. Shell company activity. Again, we have been one of the first jurisdictions that we have introduced a very, very structured definition of what constitutes non-transparent, meaning bad, shell company activity, and what do you do in certain cases when such a non-transparent shell company activity exists, which is basically to terminate the relationship. In all other jurisdictions, and please allow me to mention even in the United States.
Especially in the United States.
No, I mean, I'm not thinking because basically, Alma, I mean, most of the benchmarks that we have set here in Cyprus was based on certain guidance received from our US stakeholders. But I have to admit that there's something to learn from Cyprus here in the United States and the rest of the world. We did not follow the path of a generic definition of shell company activity and on a generic guidance of basically, please try to avoid such relationships or such activity. No, the definition was very structured, and the guidance and actually the obligation was very direct and very clear. And lastly, one of the other measures that we have introduced, it was to introduce into our customer acceptance policy certain restrictions which were quite strict, but still helped us in setting a very highly governed area of which customers do we accept. For example, we do not accept any customers dealing directly or indirectly with virtual currencies. We know that virtual currencies are facilitated in many countries all around the world, but in Cyprus, no bank, no financial institution accepts such a client which not only deals directly, but even indirectly facilitating such transactions. Therefore, as you can see, and mentioning the statistics that I've mentioned before, we have shed blood in Cyprus. And we have gladly did this because, as I said before, we saw this as an opportunity. We saw it as an opportunity to set the right governance framework in place in our country. And because we realized that anything could happen. Guys, we had our depositors losing 50% of their deposits. This has never happened before. Therefore, this was a wake-up call to us that we needed to change our culture. Therefore, we didn't need to just enhance our policies and procedures, but we needed to act and we needed to demonstrate to our stakeholders, and especially our US stakeholders, that we mean business and that we have now have in place a model jurisdiction when it comes to governance, when it comes to compliance. And thankfully, our direction was the correct one, because it hasn't taken long after the completion of our remediation program. And thus, as from year 2019, one after another recognition started coming. We had the FATF evaluation, Moneyval. Moneyval's 2019 mutual evaluation took place in year 2019. And actually, the banking sector have scored an excellent result and passed with flying colors. And that was the key reason why Cyprus is today in the white list of FATF, whereas our neighbors, Malta, is in the gray list. And I will mention a few statistics. Cyprus has been assessed based on the 40 technical ratings of the FATF, basically of Moneyval. Out of those 40 ratings of technical compliance, Cyprus has been compliant or largely compliant with 37, and only 3 points of partially compliant, none of non-compliance. And the 3 points and the 3 areas which it has scored as partially compliant, none of them related to the banking sector, one of them related to the fiduciary services providers network, the other one on the real estate sector of Cyprus, which kind of grew unreasonably high, and also the third one related to the communication of our local FIU. Well, the banking sector has actually driven a change, even in this, in an indirect way. Back in the year 2016, with the new directive issued by the Central Bank of Cyprus, we had a provision inserted there that all compliance basically reliance that was set on any of the fiduciary service providers, the professional intermediaries, it has been uplifted, and all such obligation was on the banks themselves. Therefore, although they kept the title as professional intermediaries or as fiduciary service providers, they had no substance at all, because it was the bank assessing the customer directly without any relevance given on any of those fiduciary service providers. Also, on the second aspect, this was one of the first mutual evaluations carried out by Moneyval that had introduced the effectiveness ratings. Basically, you don't just say that you've got all these nice things in place, but they also assess the effectiveness of the country as a whole. So Cyprus, out of the 11 ratings of effectiveness, in 3, it was rated as significantly effective, whereas in 8, as moderate effective, and all of the 8 that needed only very small adjustments until they reached the level of significant effectiveness, all related, none of them related to the banking sector. And we had none of low effectiveness. That was the result why the FATF kept us today in the white list, and of course OECD, we are in the white list of the OECD. But for us, the biggest practical recognition came from the United States themselves. What was the purpose that triggered even this project together that we are carrying out together with Pillsbury and Guidehouse today? It was to attract more US dollar clearing banks in Cyprus. It was basically to persuade our US stakeholders that Cyprus is a reliable and very, very credible partner to do business with. And today, as we speak, we've got 4 of the most prominent US dollar clearing correspondent banks that do business with Cyprus financial institutions. We've got HSBC, JP Morgan, Bank of New York, and Citibank, whereas just after the crisis, we only had 1. So basically, and concluding before passing on the floor to my colleague Mattheos, I would like to note that we do not consider, although I'm not directly being involved with the operations and the business, we have not actually foregone any business in Cyprus. But in Cyprus, we have basically demonstrated that investing in highly governance frameworks and investing in compliance, this leads to sustainability. And yes, we have achieved one of the most important ESG factors in Cyprus, for which all financial institutions in Cyprus can be proud of, but especially our stakeholders should be proud of, because now they've got this reliability and the credibility that they have always been seeking for. So now I'm going to pass on the floor to my colleague Mattheos, and Mattheos will be guiding you onto the various recognitions and developments that have come up following the implementation of the program that I have just described to you. Mattheos?
Thank you, Marios. And Greg, if you go to slide, next couple of slides. Yeah, okay. As Mario said, in 2014, we initiated a great effort and quite painful effort to remediate and enhance the compliance culture and the controls of the island, of the financial sector, to mitigate the risk and tackle the issue of money laundering and sanctions. Throughout the effort, we have seen a number of various stakeholders and competent authorities to praise the efforts and recognize that we are in the right direction. We have seen the Eurogroup praising the developments in Cyprus, the IMF for the economy, Moneyval making a note that we are in the right direction, and everybody is showing that the effort initiative was going in the right direction. As Mario said, in 2020, we have seen rubber sealing this effort, the recognition from Moneyval, indicating the results of the effort. And that success story has resulted in the island having 4 major US dollar clearing banks servicing our dollar payments. That's a great success. It goes to show that we have done the right job. We have achieved our target. Next slide, please, Greg. It doesn't mean we stop, but we have reached the first target. At the same time, the economy is doing well. You've seen the various rating agencies praising the economy and upgrading the economy. So in that area, are also doing well, even under the COVID circumstances. So in both fronts, we are in the right direction. Next slide, Greg, please. During that period, we've seen important announcements. The first one is from the Treasury, U.S. Department of Treasury Assistant Secretary of Terrorist Financing, Marshall Billingsley, saying that our efforts has been outstanding. We have an announcement from the Congresswoman Maxine Waters, giving us the confidence that Cyprus is up to the challenge. That's important announcements for us to rubber seal again our efforts and show that we are heading and continue to head in the right direction. At the same time, apart from the competent authorities, next slide, please, Greg. We've seen the press again showing that Bloomberg, Associated Press, Forbes, and Global Capital again indicating, among other things, that we have done the right job and we are in the right direction. And to conclude the whole thing, Greg, please, next slide. We are in the right track and we remain proactive. We always scan the regulatory landscape to adopt in the island appropriate international best practices. We always risk assess the environment and adopt practices and implement policies that will assist us in mitigating the risk and avoiding the financial crime. We seek to communicate and cooperate with the various stakeholders to defend the international markets and the island from these crimes. That's an important issue for us, to have communication and cooperation with stakeholders. That's a prime, it's very critical to give us this important mitigation power. We are committed to continue to enhance compliance structure with training, with investment and adopting best practices. So we have done the right job and we will continue the right job and always continue to enhance policies, procedure, training, and head in the direction we have started heading since 2014. I think that's my side of the story.
Thank you so much, Marios and Mateos and Dr. Pongari. We really appreciate that. So now that we've gotten a really solid overview of where Cyprus was, where it is now, and how you're locking in those reforms, we'd like to pose a few questions to you. Alma and I are going to kind of take the moderator's prerogative for a few minutes to ask you some questions that we had on our mind, and then we'll of course open it up to the floor for audience questions as well. So Alma, I'll turn it over to you for the first few questions.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for the nice introduction. And I'm really delighted to be included in this panel. So I have a few questions for the panel about the sort of practical questions on how you accomplish this, because having worked with banks all over the world and countries all over the world attempting the same thing, it is very difficult. And I think, Marios, you said it was an investment. How did you get the business to understand the payoff for that investment? Because at the beginning, when you are de-risking, exiting customers, spending money on training, on conferences, on new technology, on all of those things, we all know here that compliance puts you at a competitive advantage. How did you convince your business colleagues that it would be worth the investment?
If I could take over, and then I'll leave my colleagues to add on. Alma, we achieved this simply by shifting the importance of Cyprus, which was former an attractive offshore jurisdiction, into being an attractive, highly regulated European jurisdiction, being the center of the crossroad basically of three different continents of Europe, Africa, and China, possessing one of the most highly competent populations in Europe, and having one of the most effective basically common basis of conducting business, which is the UK law. And of course, having a jurisdiction where people cannot just do business in, but also reside in Cyprus, because it is commonly known that Cyprus has full sunshine nearly 80 to 90% throughout the whole year. Therefore, basically, we shifted the attributes to attract our investors, not for the wrong reasons, but for the right, sustainable reasons that we had in place. And of course, it's not a lot of jurisdictions that are in the whitelist, in the transparent whitelist of the OECD, amongst the other attributes that I have just mentioned before. But I'll leave my colleagues as well to add on any of this.
Yes, Alma, if I can add, if you start realizing the risk, if you get educated, you get trained, and start realizing the risk versus reward, you start doing the right thing. You assess things, you start protecting, you start cutting down on risk, and you take the right measures, and you realize you have to do the right job. So it's understanding the risk, educate people, and start doing the right thing. That's another issue that we manage, or another exercise we've done to enhance compliance and do the right thing.
And if I may add, presenting the long-term perspective of sustainable business made everybody understand and realize that this joint effort should not be short-term and short-sighted, but it should be long-term and on the right basis.
And Mario, speaking of sustainability, you told a great story when we were talking earlier about a real practical, real example of how the good business practices actually made the entire Cyprus banking sector more sustainable during the pandemic. I think the audience would really love to hear how that works. That's a great example.
Yes, of course, Alma. I mean, we talked that, and I've actually, during our discussions, I've mentioned to you a recent article that I was reading about the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who mentioned that reshaping culture requires actions and not talks. So basically, and actually, those actions should be based on the four virtues of grace, which is bravery, justice, and logic, plus one more which I miss now. Which basically what
humbleness.
Exactly. It's a composition of what business ethics entails in our words. So when we talk about sustainability, what do we include? We all know that sustainability sits on three key tiers: on environment, on the social aspect, and on governance. But rather than going and working on each of those three key pillars, we should go on the one nucleus of all of those key pillars. And this is business ethics. It's everything about what is environmental integrity, what is social equity, what is real economic prosperity. All these three key aspects of any ESG framework, it emanates from having the right business ethics. And this offers the relevant sustainability that you really want. And this is what we did in Cyprus. I know it's not easy to persuade people to start from one day to another being honest, being transparent. It's very, very difficult because this entails a change in culture. But if we lived these incidents of year 2013, we become role models for the new corporate generations to follow, then we will definitely pass on these messages. And this is what we did. We set these principles in place. And now the new generations, at least in Cyprus, they will see that this basis should be the one to follow in order to gain this sustainability we talked before.
And you're right, because you've done it and you've proven to anyone who might have been doubtful that once you get such glowing reports from Moneyval and glowing reports from other government, you keep your U.S. correspondent banking accounts, and that keeps the economy running, your international business running. And that really is the reason for the correspondent accounts.
Actually, this Alma, it will be to the detriment of Guidehouse and Pillsbury, because now we don't need any more roadshows. Now we keep quiet and we leave the results of ours to all the top. So that's it.
Exactly. No, that is the goal, right? You should be able to get rid of Pillsbury and Guidehouse once you get everything organized.
Not too soon. Not too soon.
Craig, I'm going to shift it over to you because I know you have a couple of questions for the team.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing we also wanted to do, now that we've heard your great presentation on everything that's happened in Cyprus, we thought it might be useful to do a bit of comparing and contrasting. And in particular, we wanted to talk a little bit about how your financial regulatory regime is similar to, as well as is different to what the U.S. is doing. As I'm sure as I know all of you know, and as I'm sure most of the folks listening in know, the United States passed a pretty seminal law last year, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, almost 1 year ago. And the primary purpose of that act, among numerous purposes, was better collection of beneficial ownership information. Now, Marius, as you noted, the United States is not going to require every person opening an account at a bank in the United States to go in person to validate their identity the way that Cyprus is doing, which is, of course, a wonderful program. But I'm wondering if you could, given that you're kind of part of your job is to constantly monitor activities by your allies and by your partners, how would you compare some of the new United States policies on anti-money laundering and specifically with respect to beneficial ownership collection to what you are doing in Cyprus? And
yes,
what advice would you give to some of your counterparts in the U.S. as well as in other places as they frankly try to get to where Cyprus is and some of its AML policy?
Yeah, well, as strange as it may seem, yes, we can give some structured and very, very valuable advice even to our U.S. stakeholders in relation to the ultimate beneficial ownership regime. I mean, obviously, we must admit it, Craig, that Cyprus' size, being a very, very small economy with this very, very valuable characteristic, makes it quite resilient, and that's makes it quite robust. I mean, we had the crisis, we had such a blow on our economy, and we had to have the Troika stepping in to bail out the economy. And in just 3 years, we've exited successfully the MOU. That shows a lot about the resilience of this economy and why it is so attractive to our stakeholders and our international investors we've got here in Cyprus. But one key aspect, the new key aspect to the equation now of this successful jurisdiction, of this reliable and credible jurisdiction of Cyprus, is the high governance in place now. So when we come to the ultimate beneficial ownership regime, yes, I've seen the latest revisions and enhancements of the AML framework of the United States a couple of years ago. And yes, I have noticed that now it is in the right direction. Obviously, it is a quite demanding task to request in the US for face-to-face meetings with the beneficial owners, given the size of the economy and the magnitude of the territory of the United States of America. But one thing that could be introduced, easily be introduced, which of course is going to be a very, very small burden on the financial institutions, in addition to what's already in place, is not simply to be given the information of the ultimate beneficial owner by the client himself and having it in place recorded, but also to inquire its validity yourself. The financial institution should have in place a few measures like we have, apart from a face-to-face meeting, which we put that aside. But for example, you could check, review the Articles of Association and the Constitution of the client being onboarded. And if there's anything in there that provides controlling power to any specific party, then that would trigger some bells to the institution. And yes, that could actually be construed as an additional beneficial owner to the whole of the equation. Another area is to have variable thresholds of identifying beneficial owners. For example, I know that in the US, you just follow the FATF guidance of 25% of a threshold. Why don't you lower it a bit for the high-risk clients, like we are doing now in Cyprus? In Cyprus, for high-risk customers now, we've set a threshold of 10%. Therefore, effectively, for one single client, we can have 9 different beneficial owners and 1/10 based on controlling power. We could have 10 beneficial owners at the same time in place. Therefore, these are just a few examples of what could actually even further enhance the framework that is currently in place in the US.
Well, thank you for that, Marios. And what I would just say in response is, as you mentioned, the Association of Cyprus Banks has gone on several roadshows touting all of the reforms that you all have made. It's been my pleasure to join you for those. And we have been told by congressional staff who were responsible for drafting U.S. reforms to U.S. anti-money laundering laws, that your example and the information you shared really influenced the way that they worked on this seminal law and the seminal change in law. And I'm sure U.S. regulators are now benefiting from the guidance that you are providing and other international pace setters are providing as the U.S. takes its law and implements it via regulation, which is remains an ongoing process. So you've had a tangible impact on that, and I'm sure you'll continue to share best practices.
Exactly. Craig, if I may, because at the same time I've been looking to some of the questions of the audience as well. But
I was just about to turn that. Go ahead.
That we mentioned, but I have not really, we have not been really given the time to elaborate further. It was something that both of my colleagues, Dr. Bangare as well as Mattheos, have mentioned before, but I'll need to give some more information about the Cyprus investment program and what was all the so-called golden visas, and what was the interaction and the involvement of the banking sector in this scheme. First of all, we all need to understand that the Cyprus, any investment program however it's been designed in any EU member state, it's a European program. It is not a Cypriot program. It is a European program, which of course it was given on the basis of certain guidelines to all EU members, and each country then developed its own framework of how to apply it. Yes, initially Cyprus, in the past years, it has applied a very loose framework in place. But gradually, seeing the various gaps that existed and the various incidents coming on the surface, this was gradually being enhanced and with more restrictions and more controls. However, despite any decision made by the government in relation to this program, the banking sector has had its own regime in place. The KYC applied and the due diligence applied in any customer, it was irrelevant of wherever it was emanating, but it had to do with assessing the risk. And for the banking sector, for years, any investor requesting to facilitate its investment for the CIP program, for the Citizenship by Investment program, it was considered as a high-risk transaction, and that entailed enhanced due diligence measures being taken. Therefore, and there were incidents that many such transactions were approved by the government authorities, but they were declined by the Cypriot banks. And that's why many such investors elected to use a financial institution outside of Cyprus to facilitate this investment of theirs, rather than using a Cypriot bank, which would mean that they had to go through rigorous due diligence, which was obviously lengthy. And of course, if they didn't have all the information that they needed, or they were reluctant to provide any transparent information, they would have been declined. But in any case, this program now has shut down, as it used to be carried out. And the new regime of investments and granting of citizenship is very, very focused on certain key areas of the economy, requesting actually people to be residing physically, etc., etc.
Maria, if I can add, Greg, for the golden passports, the banks were involved in the flow of funds, as Mario said. In the due diligence we did for these customers, we went the extra mile and did reports, externally did the reports, with on-the-ground intelligence. So we went to understand the source of wealth, source of funds, to understand the legitimacy of funds. And it was a simple flow. We didn't just accept the money. We did the right job. And where we thought there was a risk, we rejected the transaction. And the second point is that it doesn't mean somebody was involved in the golden passports. There is an open account in the Cypriot banks. It's not one-to-one relationship. So it's two things. Even the enhanced relation on the transactions, it doesn't we have these customers sitting with the banking sector in Cyprus. That
makes sense. Mm-hmm.
We had one other audience question, and I think I'll summarize it a bit since we've covered some of the other material within the question. What are some of the technology investments that your banks have made to enhance your compliance regimes and as well as to actually comply with laws more generally? How big of a function has that been in addition to all of the processes and human decisions that you've made? Speak to that a little bit, please.
Okay, I'll start and give a few examples. Actually, our key main systems that we've got in place, our financial crime systems, are systems that are based on the, well, it's not the latest, but it was actually FinCEN's guidance that is based on real-time monitoring of transactions. All systems in all banks in Cyprus, they operate through such systems. Therefore, all transactions taking place are monitored real-time against all sanctions lists and against all scenarios that we built in within those systems ourselves. However, I would also like to make a very, very special note here that the COVID pandemic has actually been partly a blessing for the banking sector in Cyprus, because it has given us the opportunity and the push to even further invest even more on technology. And actually, we have introduced in Cyprus, and I don't think that there is any other jurisdiction around the southeastern European region that has introduced digital verification of customers. Given the COVID pandemic, the regulator has been persuaded and they have adjusted and enhanced the relevant AML regulatory framework, giving the relevant directions and guidance of how can potential institutions be utilizing such systems. And today we onboard customers digitally from anywhere in the world, and the controls of verifying the validity of the identity is actually 3 times more, I wouldn't use the word strict, but actually effective than what it used to be with the manual means that was used before. Therefore, these are a few of the key aspects, and currently we're actually contemplating and discussing together with the regulator for the establishment of an electronic KYC platform where all banks in Cyprus, we shall be providing and having our clientele, the KYC documentation of our clientele in digital form, and to be exchanged more effectively between different banks, thus improving not just the effectiveness of the updating of the documents in place, but also the efficiency of the process of onboarding clients to different institutions.
Greg, also, we've seen important technologies coming out, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data visualization. Is technology we are exploring and watching and trying to implement in our arsenal of weapons. So things are coming out that we are evaluating, will implement as we go forward. So it's a constant evaluation, implementation of technologies to assist us. So it doesn't stop. It's continuous effort.
Actually, the latest technology that is actually regulated, it's a regulated obligation now via the directive. It's to be having in place systems and even better artificial intelligence systems to monitor adverse media And what we've got now in place in nearly all institutions in Cyprus is such systems in place that filter the totality of the clientele on a daily basis against such adverse media, so that we can take this piece of information and consider it in the overall due diligence that we perform.
But that's just great. What a great story.
Well, it could have been better. This gives us the kind of hope that we can achieve more, because if we say we've achieved everything, then we sit back and we do nothing. So
no, it changes every day. Exactly. Yes. It's a never-ending journey.
Well, I see that we've come to the end of our allotted time here. Again, we really want to thank everyone for joining this conversation. We certainly hope all those who've joined have found it enlightening and frankly uplifting, because they're in a very, very troubled and difficult world. We have a true unmitigated success story that our friends from Cyprus have been able to tell us today. So again, want to thank everybody for joining. Alma, of course we want to thank Guidehouse for being our partner on this webinar, and of course the Association of Cyprus Banks for making these gentlemen available to us today. Thank you so much to all, and did want to let you know that a replay of this webcast will be shared with everyone who's registered. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to hear it later on in the replay. But again, thanks so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.